The dense forest was eerily silent as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. This was the heart of the Blackwood Forest, a place steeped in local legend and feared by many. Elena had heard the stories all her life. Tales of strange creatures that roamed the woods, of hikers who ventured in and never returned, and of a monstrous wild boar that was said to haunt the deepest parts of the forest. But Elena was a rational woman, a biologist by trade, and she didn't believe in old wives' tales. She had come to Blackwood Forest for one reason: to study the unique flora and fauna that thrived in its secluded environment. Armed with her backpack, flashlight, and a detailed map, Elena felt confident as she made her way through the thick underbrush. Her footsteps crunched softly on the forest floor, and the beam of her flashlight cut through the gathering darkness. She planned to set up camp near a small clearing she had marked on her map, a place that promised rich biodiversity and a chance to observe nocturnal creatures in the natural habitat. As she walked, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was a sensation that had been with her since she entered the forest earlier that day. She dismissed it as nerves, a byproduct of the spooky stories she had heard growing up. But every now and then, she would stop and listen, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Each time, she saw nothing but the shifting shadows and heard nothing but the natural sounds of the forest. By the time Elena reached the clearing, the moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape. She set up her small tent and built a fire, the flickering flames providing a sense of comfort and security. As she prepared a simple meal, she made notes in her journal, documenting the various plants and animals she had encountered on her hike. The night wore on, and Elena found herself growing drowsy. She decided to turn in, extinguishing the fire and crawling into her tent. The forest was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds lull her to sleep. Elena woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay still, straining to hear what had disturbed her. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She reached for her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as she scanned the interior of her tent. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing, sending a shiver down Elena's spine. She froze, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Elena's mind raced, recalling the tales of the monstrous wild boar. She tried to convince herself it was just a normal animal, perhaps a bear or a deer. But then she heard the snorting, a deep, menacing sound that seemed to reverberate through the ground. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she knew without a doubt that something was out there, something that didn't belong. She remained motionless, barely daring to breathe, hoping that whatever it was would move on. The growling and snorting grew louder, more insistent. Elena could hear heavy footsteps circling her tent, accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig. She clutched the flashlight tighter, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She had no weapons, no means of defending herself if the creature decided to attack. After what felt like an eternity, the noises began to recede, growing fainter as the creature moved away. Elena remained still, too frightened to move or make a sound. She listened intently, her senses on high alert, but the forest had returned to its unnatural silence. Hours passed, and Elena finally allowed herself to relax, though sleep was impossible. She lay awake, her mind replaying the terrifying encounter over and over. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to leave the forest and return to civilization as soon as possible. As dawn broke, Elena emerged from her tent, her body stiff and sore from the night's tension. The clearing looked peaceful in the morning light, but she knew better. She quickly packed up her gear, her eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of movement. She felt exposed and vulnerable, and the urge to flee was overwhelming. Elena set off at a brisk pace, following the path she had marked on her map. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing but still filled with an oppressive sense of dread. She walked for hours, her nerves on edge, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making her jump. As she neared the edge of the forest, Elena's relief was palpable. She could see the sunlight filtering through the trees, and the open fields beyond. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the nightmare behind. But just as she was about to step out of the woods, she heard it again, the low, guttural growl that had haunted her the previous night. She froze, her blood running cold. Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the wild boar. It was unlike any boar she had ever seen, its massive body covered in coarse, matted fur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. Its tusks were long and razor-sharp, and it regarded her with a malevolent gaze. Elena took a step back, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't outrun the creature, and she had no means of defending herself. The boar took a step forward, its growl deepening, a clear warning. In a moment of clarity, Elena remembered the flare gun in her backpack, a safety precaution she had almost forgotten. She slowly reached for it, her eyes never leaving the boar. The creature watched her intently, its muscles tensing as if preparing to charge. With trembling hands, Elena pulled out the flare gun and aimed it at the boar. She took a deep breath and fired, the flare shooting out with a loud pop and a burst of bright light. The boar recoiled, letting out an enraged bellow. Seizing the opportunity, Elena turned and ran, her legs pumping furiously as she sprinted out of the forest and into the open fields. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, parked at the edge of the forest. She threw her backpack into the back seat and jumped in, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, the forest receding in her rearview mirror. Elena didn't stop driving until she reached the safety of her home. She locked the doors and collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The encounter had left her shaken, and she knew it would be a long time before she ventured into the wilderness again. In the days that followed, Elena tried to make sense of what had happened. She scoured the internet for any information about the wild boar, but found nothing that matched her experience. The locals she spoke to were reluctant to talk, their faces paling when she mentioned the creature. Eventually, Elena came to accept that some things were beyond explanation, that the world still held mysteries that science couldn't unravel. She returned to her work, but the memory of the wild boar never left her. It lingered at the edges of her mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the light. Years passed, and Elena moved on with her life, her encounter with the wild boar becoming a distant, though still vivid, memory. She avoided forests, preferring the safety of more familiar environments. But sometimes, on quiet nights, she would find herself staring into the darkness, wondering if the creature was still out there, waiting. One evening, as she sat on her porch, enjoying the cool night air, Elena heard a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the low, guttural growl of the wild boar. She froze, her eyes scanning the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. There, at the edge of her property, just beyond the reach of the porch light, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. The boar had found her,